Hey, it's Terry with Something Spooky, and these are very special videos because I'm reading some of my own stories. These are from my new book, Graveyard Games and Other Scary Stories, which you can get on Amazon. You just check that out on my page or just search Graveyard Games on Amazon and you'll find it. This story is called Ready or Not. A tree had been rooted behind the old woman's house since before she was there. It was an old tree when she was a young girl. The tree had been there in that spot through the window in her kitchen since it was her father's house. Towered over the wood deck that she set the bird food on as her mother had taught her. The tree had been there all that time until the night she saw it pick up and walk from its place in the ground with a sentient gait to the shadows of the night. The tree had rotted since Eddie, Nancy's husband of 46 years, passed away in the fall 15 years earlier. Nancy had marveled that the behemoth had stayed standing while it seemed to decay and wither away year after year. There were summer storms in that time in which she waited for the wood giant to attack her house. In repeating nightmares, the powerful limbs of the monstrosity would crash through her roof and reach down to her bed. She would wake, yelling in a chilled sweat, and spent sleepless hours staring at the faded picture of Eddie that watched over her behind a glass frame from the small table by their bedside. When her daughter stopped visiting with the grandkids about 7 years after Eddie's passing, because the kids had grown old enough to be busy and their mother had grown too worn and tired to make the long trip from California to Illinois, there was no one left to pester her about how something should be done. Since that time, Nancy had only hosted a handful of house guests, most of them of an impersonal nature. Since she was alone in her corner of the world in her father's beautiful house with the big yard and tall tree. Without much else to do, Nancy would carefully observe the trees change through the season. She would sit out on the deck and crochet or do crossword puzzles with just the occasional glances at the vibrant color of the leaves. Then, about 5 years ago, she started sketching the trees' different shapes over the months of the year. The first was just on a napkin, dampened by the perspiration from her glass of iced tea, with a dollar store pen she had been working on a crossword search with. But after the first year, she graduated to colored pencils that etched the features of the wounded bark and then watercolor paintings that most captured the chaotic beauty of the blender of shades and designs hanging from the branches. About a year before she witnessed the inanimate being lumber from its place in the yard, Nancy had a different dream that caused her to wake and walk to the window to check on the tree. She had sat in its shade on a cool spring grass with Eddie, his head resting in her lap and her arms draped around his body. Small pellets of blood began to drop from above like a gentle rain. As they dripped all around them and splattered on Eddie's skin, they took no notice of them at all. The gore turned from a drip to a downpour, and as Nancy's vision of the scene slowly panned out, she recognized that the blood was leaking directly from the leaves above them. That morning, she stood in the kitchen and stared out the window for hours and watched as the sun rose into her picturesque closet of civilization. Her dreams had become less frequent, and she didn't spend as much time sitting outside with the tree. She had nearly established new hobbies and routines, starting with a little garden and the patch of soil lining her front porch. About a month before the end, she even called a local service to inspect the tree, but never heard from them after the scheduling call and made no further effort. The final night she had spent cooking in its gaze. She thought that she hadn't spent so much time in the kitchen since Eddie's passing, when she made him dinner every night. That night she made pumpkin chili and listened to old records on the turntable that she dusted off and plugged in for the first time in decades. After she finished her meal and placed the leftovers in the freezer, she sat in her recliner and opened a book that she had endeavored to finish for longer than she could remember. It had been Eddie's chair and still had that same worn patchwork fabric as when he had last been in it. Her gluttony of time had rendered it hers, and she had spent many nights sleeping in it after waking from a bad dream or falling asleep earlier than she intended. When she woke, she imagined she could smell and feel him there, but these sensations were fleeting as the dim oppressive reality grasped her again. That final night, when she woke in the recliner, she did not smell Eddie's still familiar scent, but instead was overtaken by a wave of sulfur and copper. The house seemed darker than usual, and shadows played across the walls from a light source she could not identify. Still, half asleep, she stumbled into the kitchen and was immediately drawn to the neighborly shape of the tree through the window. She stood and stared as, without any motive or reason, the tree began to casually move from its place in the ground. A paralyzing fear kept her watching as it drifted from where the world had put it and moved it into the shadows away from her porch. It was quickly out of the frame of her window, an incomprehensible void where it had been. She didn't know where it had gone, but she knew she must follow.